going into the conversation, I'd love to just hear a little bit more about you. The first question I pose to everyone, so when you tell us about yourself, if you could also let us know when that pivotal moment occurred for you and you became a proponent of cannabis reform.
Well, thank you for having me, Felicia. I'm just I'm a lawyer that got into politics because I got mad at the city. I did environmental law for about 16 years, and I was frustrated at some of the things I saw going on in San Diego. So I ran for city council. Got to know local government. Was the first city council president. Then became a port commissioner, and then in 2011, some people I thought were my friends suggested I should run for Congress. So I did, and was fortunate to be elected in 2012. And since 2013, I've been making the cross-country trip. Cannabis was never part of my program or something that I was concerned about as a policy issue until after I got into office, and for two reasons. Two things I found out about. One was at UCSD, San Diego is the home of the Center for Medical Cannabis Research. For the past 20 years has been the leading organization looking at cannabis and autism, psychosis, bipolar, pain. All that information was right here in my backyard. And I thought, I always try to say to San Diegans, I want to marry up what's happening in Washington with what is important to San Diego. So we had that. But the other thing was more profound was that, we have a big military community here, and a community of veterans. And we saw that a lot of them were finding that cannabis was useful for pain. And this is all very alleged to be anecdotal, but it was real. And so it seemed to me that we ought to start exploring a different approach than we've had. And then I think finally, the more we've learned about criminal justice, even before the recent issues with George Floyd and so forth, there's just a strain on the system, and putting people in jail for cannabis just doesn't seem to make sense as a policy matter. So that's how I kind of came to where I am, thinking about rethinking cannabis policy.
Well, I'm glad you had an opportunity to have conversations with individuals that help shift the tide. I know that oftentimes that's where a lot of this starts. You were talking about some medical, we were talking about veterans in particular. I'd like to, I have a bunch of questions that I've shared with you that are just a little more generic. I want to be able to get some of the audience questions in and integrate them in, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
So are there ways the state can get behind or fund medical cannabis research if the federal government won't address these issues?
Well, I think first of all, the federal government probably needs to get out of the way. It's scary for organizations to be dealing with cannabis while it's still listed as Class 1. So I think it needs to be delisted. What's the term for that? Anyway, it's got to be taken off the list of dangerous substances. Just escaping my brain now. And I think that state by state, there's interest in different policies, and that's typically how we've dealt with things. So California has a pretty good approach to this right now. We did a ballot measure that was very well thought out. I think leaves a lot of flexibility for science and for policymakers to figure out how to use this. And I think we should support rigorous scientific research to look at the effects of cannabis and streamlining access to cannabis for researchers. And that's some of the things that I'm interested in doing.
Absolutely.
Descheduling. That's it.
Descheduling is going to definitely help a lot.
Right.
I want to pose one of the last questions that I had posed to Representative Correa to you.
Right.
It's a mouthful, so bear with me. So, and I'm really curious as somebody who does a lot of criminal justice work in particular, is when will the amount of time and money spent on repair, i.e. expungement, reentry, social equity, community reinvestment, match, or for somebody like me, surpass the amount of time and money spent on prohibition, i.e. policing, incarceration, the creation of collateral consequences, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, the Probably not, but the good news is it will save a lot of money. And we don't have to spend as much on those things as we've spent on, and frankly, I think in retrospect, maybe it was done in good faith, but it's been a lot of wasted money. And I think if we stop wasting that money and spend it on other things that are important to Americans, I think that will be all to the good.
I love that. Thank you. Because that was an honest answer to be able to really address. As somebody who's navigated the space kind of as an outsider and then pushed themselves in because they were really tired of what they saw going on in the world, what are some of the best ways that we as an industry or as individuals, what are the best ways for us to educate our elected officials about cannabis?
Well, I think you need to reach out. I think, look, for all the talk about money in politics, it's voters who decide whether we get reelected or not. And some of the best conversations I've had have been from voters who I had no idea had found some use to cannabis. A couple of my former campaign workers are now actually in the business. And I think that understanding how you can be helpful, understanding what the issues are, what the opportunities are, what the obstacles are, that's all stuff that you can educate your elected official about. Remember, there's 535 of us. If you want to talk to me, we all have different backgrounds, and we're probably experts in one thing. So if you want to talk to me about how to build a landfill liner for municipal solid waste, we can talk peer to peer. But if you want to talk to me about research on cannabis or the obstacles to running a business, like banking was something I found out about. Those are the kinds of things that your elected official can learn from you just by setting up a meeting.
Fantastic. So one of the questions that just was posed is, we know that we've had at Mississippi State a study on cannabis. A lot of us are, as Yvette had mentioned, she's never seen or heard of any reports. So we've had 20 years worth of studying. What can you share with us about these reports or the findings or the lack thereof?
Well, I'd be better off turning you over to UCSD. I think one of their frustrations has been, just in terms of future research, is that even getting access to stuff to test has been a challenge for them. And so I think that there's some votes coming up in Congress that would help take some of the pressure off that. But we don't have the research on cannabis that we would have on a pharmaceutical. And I think the more we can do of that, the better off we'll be. Cannabis is something that's in the society. People have found it of use, and I think pursuing more precision about that would be useful. And as to the extent of availability of reports, I haven't looked at that myself, but I'm kind of curious about that, and I'll check into it.
Definitely. I'm going to follow up with you because now I'm curious.
Yeah.
One of the other questions from one of the attendees was, what's the best way for us to get active in our communities regarding certain points of drug reform, houselessness, and mental health? And they asked, are there any resources or strategic approaches that we recommend, because, as they stated, now's the time to get active?
Yes, I mean, again, I think when we're talking about a vote on federal policy this month, I think it will probably. I think it will pass. It probably will get a few Republicans on it. As these things come up, I mean, really, it's not that complicated just to get in touch with your member of Congress or their staffers. If you can do it as a group, if you know someone who knows that person, that's helpful. I mean, a lot of us are just new. A lot of people are new to the issue. They're open to it. If you're like me, you probably have, a lot of your views were set in the 80s. Things have changed since then, and I think people need to be updated. So I don't believe it's that complicated. Just reaching out through an email, asking for a meeting with the staffer or a member is pretty easy to do. And of course, the more local the office, the easier it would be, I think. And but even a member of Congress, I think, is interested in talking to constituents. You may have to do it virtually now. That has its pluses, and its minuses. But at least you don't have to travel, and it's probably easier to get that person on the line.
And I can attest to how easy it is in terms of being able to talk to your elected officials from a lay point. They do want to
Right.
hear. Their staff is definitely here to work for us.
Right. The first thing I ask when a bill comes to my, when we're talking about a bill in DC, I ask, what have we heard from San Diego? What does San Diego think about this? Because I want to know really if people in my district have an opinion about it. I want to know if there's proponents or opponents, if anyone cares. So, weigh in, even if you leave a message on a phone, if you don't have time to have a meeting, that's very useful. We got 100 calls about this bill and support. That's an important piece of input. So, just weighing in, I think is really useful.
Absolutely. That's just, for us, it's to remind our friends to make those calls and to let them know that we want them to support bills that support us.
Right.
My last question to you, what are you going to do to lead with more compassion and fight for a more equitable world in and outside of cannabis?
I don't mean to make this a political discussion, but I'm very concerned about the tone that's set by the president of us versus them. And whatever the issue is, whether it's cannabis or climate change or healthcare, we can't solve big problems unless we remember to care about each other. And this whole notion that Republicans and Democrats are enemies, it's not sustainable. So we have to figure out a way to have more compassion with each other, to remember that we are the United States of America. We've got to put United back in there. And if we can do that with compassion and with patriotism, I think we can solve a lot of problems.
I agree with you. There's a lot we can do together that we need to start really thinking about.
Right.
What do you envision as a Californian in DC? What do you envision for the cannabis industry and for those of us here?
I think the future is pretty good here. I would like to get past this banking issue. I think the inability to, pass the Safe Banking Act has been a problem. But you can see that this is not such a partisan issue. I think people across the country are interested in, a more sophisticated approach to cannabis. And that doesn't mean that there won't be any issues. I do think that, we, even regulating alcohol, we do have to do some regulation. We have to make sure that there is some law enforcement around safety issues with respect to alcohol. But that's a much more sane regulatory system than we have right now, and you can sell it, and it doesn't have to be all cash. And also, I think we understand the pluses and minuses of alcohol better. We just need a more rational approach to cannabis. I think that's coming, and I think that will be good for the industry as well as for people who use the product.
And on that note, one of our attendees asked a question, and it wasn't something that we were able to pose earlier, but they mentioned that they use cannabis in particular for their fibromyalgia and other birth-related disorders. They also obviously got to participate in our compassionate use program in particular. They want to know, what can states do to continue to support compassion?
I think I guess I'd suggest to the person who went through this thing, and God bless them, that they have a better sense for what needs to happen than I might have if I hadn't suffered that kind of thing. But if they've experienced difficulty or a lack of compassion, I think it's important to raise that up and say, hey, this has really helped me, and this is how difficult it was for me to get there. Don't want this to happen to another person. And your elected officials, I think, are generally open to that. They want to be helpful, and I think that's an important point to raise.